One thing that is very interesting that I can imagine doing more on is just the passage of time, living in reality, and trans-identification and how that operates with time. And there was a particular paper written by a psychologist named Alessandra Lemma that is brilliant. It's very clinical. It's very psychodynamic. So, I mean, if you are a therapist or you're inclined to really enjoy kind of therapy talk, you should read it. It's very interesting. But there's a little excerpt that I want to share with you. The paper is about a patient she worked with that is a male to female young person who transitioned pretty young. And I think at the time of writing the paper, the person was late teens, early 20s, something like that. And it's essentially about how puberty blockers, which this young person had been on, distort not only biological time as they prevent the development of the body, but also psychological time. And Lemma hypothesizes that these puberty blockers can distort the relationship to the past, to the present, to the passing of time, and create a really serious disturbance in the young person or the person's ability to live in time, in reality. It's a fascinating idea. She's not as, I guess, critical of affirming care as somebody like myself, but she's very insightful, and she is critical of how puberty blockers may impact our functioning. So she says, working with transsexual patients invites the analyst to consider interesting questions about time, because where the body is extensively modified, altered from how it was given to one by one's parents in the past, the individual's relationship to time is also affected. This is so when the modification is aimed at deleting what the body unconsciously represents for that individual. These considerations are especially relevant to the current debates about the practice of delaying puberty through hormone treatment, giving the patient time to make permanent decisions later in his or her teens. In some cases, I suggest that this pubertal and physical limbo, followed for some young people with radical transformation to the body through SRS, warps the relationship to time, fueling an omnipotent state of mind characterized by a severance with the reality of before me-ness. This is really powerful because she's saying being able to modify parts of yourself and delete your past, delete your history, creates a false sense of omnipotence for people, like a God complex, that makes it hard to actually deal with the concrete, tangible, time moves forward, whether we like it or not, aspects of reality. It's very interesting. And of course, I wonder, what is the relationship between name change and this process, right? She's talking specifically about puberty blockers and the way you can kind of delete aspects of your development or your past or your body or biology. I wonder, at times, can the name change represent enough of a shift so that it staves off having to do permanent interventions? I don't know. What we know is that there are a lot of young people who adopt a kind of non-binary identity. And of course, some of them do medicalize and have mastectomies, for example. But a lot of young people adopt a non-binary identity, change their name, and that's the extent of their experimentation. So it might be that the name change kind of symbolically represents, even though it's not really going to put true distance between yourself and the parts you don't like, kind of a symbolic version of doing that in a way that does not necessitate making some kind of a physical manifestation of that new identity. So I don't know, but that is a really interesting question. When we think about time, it also brings up another theme today of reconstructing the past. Many of you will know that trans-identified kids sometimes have a very different recollection of their childhood than you. And before I dive into this, I just want to say I have had the pleasure of working with a lot of trans-identified kids very long term. So getting to know them when they're teens and then into their adulthood years. And indeed, I think sometimes kids who are very compliant, somewhat reserved, may have a robust internal world that you don't know about, where they are dealing with things that are not clear to others. So I don't want to make it sound like every time a young person describes a memory differently than how their parents remember it, that they are kind of fabricating the past, or they're kind of brainwashed by the internet or something like that. There are always nuances and variation and individual differences, right? But sometimes it's very explicit, like when we were on, so-and-so vacation, your daughter definitely begged you for that pink bikini. And she's saying, no, I hated that thing. Like, I didn't want to buy it at all. You forced me to wear it. And you're like, what? So there are some things that are explicit, but sometimes the more granular kind of fine details, a young person may have been really conflicted about something. And so the way they express themselves is maybe, not a real reflection of how they felt. So I want to start with a really cool article that I saw, and a clip from the beginning of it. It's not a clip, it's an excerpt. So it says, abandoning the past and building a better future is harder than it sounds. At home, I dreamt that at Naples, I could be intoxicated with beauty and lose my sadness. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in his essay Self-Reliance in 1841, quote, I pack my trunk, embrace my friends, embark on the sea, and at last wake up in Naples, end quote. Sounds wonderful, but he continues, quote, and there beside me is the stern fact, the sad self, unrelenting, identical, that I fled from. Quote, so it says, you can't escape your past because it travels with you into the future, inside your head. Your memories are the first thing you unpack in Naples. The point here is you cannot alter your history. However, you can change your perception of it. So I'll include that article. It kind of has some somewhat pop psychology tips on how to change your perception with like gratitude journals and things like that. So it's not that deep, but I still think it's really practical and useful. And one thing that I found interesting was that the article talks about some science that shows how you're feeling now actually reflects how you remember things from your past. So like we talked about a moment ago, if your child currently is in kind of the midst of a depression, they're going to have that depressive state color their memories of the past, color the way they recollect specific events and situations. So with trans-identified kids, I think sometimes it's just that they're in a funk right now and they're misremembering the past because of that. I think sometimes they are really attached to the idea that this identity is their solution. And so they're kind of trying to make it make sense. So they're fishing in their history for like moments of gender nonconformity or moments where that's proof of my trans identity, right? Kind of fishing for proof. Sometimes I think young people may read something enough times that they actually come to believe it, right? And this is a bit like multiple personality disorders, the repressed memories epidemic, and there's some resources about that at the end of the video. Now, I do want to say this is really important. If a young person, let's take it out of the context of gender identity in the year 2023. Let's say it's 1982 or something. If a person is consolidating their sexual orientation and they may have, let's say a female may have the desire to experiment with some masculine appearance, masculine clothing, whatever, it's actually very understandable that wouldn't necessarily emerge until adolescence. Adolescence is when you start picking your own clothes for the most part. Adolescence is when you start thinking for yourself about how you want to show up in the world and how you want to present yourself. I mean, there are, of course, cases of very gender nonconforming females from a young age where parents knew, like, oh my God, my daughter is very masculine, like this is how she is. But there are lots of other, accounts of women who present in a masculine way that in their early childhood, their parents dressed them and their parents are the ones who kind of provided the cues for how to behave. So I don't think gender nonconformity in and of itself is always just an expression of taking on an ROGD kind of identity, and then after the fact trying to mold yourself into masculine. But you could tell when it looks put on, so I think it depends on the situation. But regarding reconstructing the past, I think it's worth looking at how memory is so unreliable and it's so strongly impacted by a lot of factors, including, again, our mood. So keep all of that in mind if you are trying to figure out if your child's version of events was true, your version of events was true. I think it's very tricky, and there's probably more to say about that, but we'll leave it there for now.